Hi, I'm Richard Reiberg, and this is Could Nazi Germany Have Defeated Russia? Why does this matter for us today? When America was operating in Iraq and Afghanistan, we were not initially fighting to win the hearts and minds of the people, but there just to win the war. Today, even though we have fewer soldiers, we are more effectively fighting the enemy because we are trying to convince the people that the Taliban are pretty bad people. We can see in history, if the Nazis had used this tactic when liberating different areas from Soviet control, they may have had people help them in their cause when fighting the Soviets. How to destroy a much larger army. Germany and Russia were going to fight at some point, this is a fact. Instead of fighting them while trying to defeat the British and turning it into a two-front fight, it would have been wiser to either defeat the British or have a ceasefire before engaging the Soviets. Because during this time, whenever you're fighting a two-front battle, you're having to dilute resources and have your reserves thinned out to fight on two fronts at the same time. And for Germany, being a smaller nation than Russia, and Britain being separate because of a sea mask and having a stronger navy, it was hard for Germany to either invade Britain, even though they didn't really have a navy at all, and it was harder to fight Russia because they were such a big landmass that there was a lot of area to cover. So fighting on both the west and the east, it's very difficult to do this at the same time without running into conflicts or running out of resources. Germany could have fought to capture first the areas of North Africa, where there were rich oil fields in Saudi Arabia, then use the resources to try and fight the Russians, or force Britain into a ceasefire. So on this slide, I show here German fuel consumption. You can see here in 1936, the demand of MBD. MBD stands for 1,000 barrels of oil every day. 1936, they're consuming 102 MBD of oils every day. Germany was still very reliant upon trains and horses to get around. Trains because coal was a better resource they had available to them at the time than oil. We can also see here Germany only consumed 122 MBD compared to over 3,600 the USA produced during 1939. So eventually, when the US finally entered the war, the US was already outproducing Germany by a lot of oil compared to Germany, even though the USA wasn't even in wartime in 1939. So we can see here, around 1943, the German fuel consumption was going up, and then in 1944, it dropped by over 20%, because at this point, Germany had finally reached its final reserves of oil, and in 1945 they had practically ran out of oil completely. Also, the production of less complicated tanks and just a higher quantity of them may have helped increase the amount of armored fighting vehicles Germany could have had to fight the Russian tank production that ultimately defeated Germany. So, going to this slide here, I have another slide that shows that how many tanks were produced during World War II by the different nations. We can see here in first place, USSR produced 102,000 tanks. In second place, which is the USA, which entered the war in late 1941 and didn't really start fighting until 1942, we can see they produced 99,500 tanks, mainly the M4 Sherman. And then we can see here in third place, the German Reich, which produced 46,300 tanks, and they were producing tanks since 1939. So we can clearly see that just two nations, the USSR and the USA, outproduced the Germans' tank production by over 4 times, almost 5 times as many tanks than the Germans had. Also, not invading the USSR during winter would have been beneficial since the Germans did not have enough proper winter clothing at the time. We can also see recently in history when Napoleon was invading Russia, he was ultimately stopped by the Russian winter, which pretty much defeated his entire army instead of the Russians. And also the Russians employed the scorched field earth tactic. So as the Russians were retreating, they would literally burn all other resources because the Russians were going to have them and they weren't going to let the enemy have them. So this showed that even though the Germans were advancing, they couldn't collect resources on the way. And also, the more time they wasted trying to chase down the Russian army instead of fighting them, ultimately led to them being caught with their pants down, basically, by the Russian winter that pretty much stopped the entire German advance from the winter. If Germany had not engaged on two fronts and had captured the oil reserves in North Africa, they could have defeated a much larger nation and would have been more effective fighting the Soviets. Also, if the Germans implemented the strategy that the US currently uses in Afghanistan, they could have potentially recruited more people to fight for their cause or even support their fight. In summary, Germany came very close to defeating the Soviet Union initially and could have won the battle with better planning. These are more sources: how Nazi Germany could have crushed Russia during World War II, infographic, did industrial capacity win the Second World War, oil and war, and American involvement in wars from colonial times to the present. Thank you.